Chapter 1. Ripples. New York City had never truly been silent, but the strange hush that had fallen over its bustling streets was a new kind of quiet, an eerie, pulsating stillness that seemed to hint at something lurking just beneath the surface. Detective Samantha Trapanetti, known to her peers as Trap, stood overlooking the Hudson River, the pre-dawn light casting long shadows that danced across the water. The city behind her was stirring, but the air held a tension that had nothing to do with the usual morning rush. Beside her, Christian McAfee, Mackie to those few he considered friends, flipped through pages of his weathered journal, filled with notes on various occult phenomena. "It's starting again," he murmured, not looking up from his writings. "Can you feel it? The city's energy is off." Trap nodded slowly, her mind racing through the events of the past weeks. After their last case, they'd hoped the city's supernatural disturbances would subside. But hope was a luxury a detective could seldom afford. As they prepared to leave, Trap's phone buzzed. A message from the precinct. Another incident had been reported, this time at a small park in Lower Manhattan. No details yet, just an address and a request for her specific expertise. The scene at the park was chaotic, even for a Monday morning. Officers cordoned off an area near a sprawling oak tree, beneath which lay the remnants of what appeared to be a ritual: candles, symbols in the dirt, and an unsettling chill in the air that made even the most skeptical officers uneasy. Trap crouched by the symbols, her eyes tracing the intricate patterns. They weren't just random, they were deliberate, potent. Magic had been performed here, and not the harmless kind. Mackie joined her, kneeling to examine the ground. "This is an invocation circle," he explained, pointing to each symbol in turn. "But it's incomplete. Whatever they were trying to call forth wasn't fully summoned." "Or it was interrupted," Trap suggested, standing to survey the area. Her gaze landed on a bystander, a young man who seemed too interested in the proceedings. His clothes were slightly too big, his hair a mess of tangles. And as their eyes met, he looked away, a flicker of panic crossing his features. Without a word, Trap began making her way toward him, her detective instincts kicking in. The man saw her coming and hesitated, torn between running and staying. Mackie followed closely behind, ready to assist. "New York Police Department," Trap announced as she reached him, showing her badge. "I need to ask you a few questions." The man nodded, swallowing hard. I was just passing by," he stammered, avoiding her gaze. "Nobody just passes by a police cordon to get a closer look at an invocation circle," Mackie interjected, his tone gentle but firm. "What did you see here?" The man hesitated, then spoke in a rush. "I saw them. The people who set this up. They were chanting, and then something went wrong. There was a scream, and everyone just scattered." Trap exchanged a look with Mackie. This was no random act of vandalism. It was something far more sinister. As they escorted the man to the squad car for a more formal interview, Trap felt the familiar thrill of the hunt stir within her. The city might never be silent, but for Trap and Mackie, its whispers held the secrets they vowed to uncover. Chapter 2. Echoes of the Past. The morning's interrogation revealed little new information. The young man, named Timothy, was a local college student with an interest in the occult, a hobby that led him to the wrong place at the wrong time. Despite his fear, his account seemed genuine. He was a witness, not a participant. Back at the precinct, Detective Trapp pored over the evidence collected at the scene. The ritualistic setup was disturbingly familiar, a déjà vu she wished hadn't followed her into the new dawn. She spread out photos of the circle, the candles, and the symbols etched into the earth, her brow furrowed in concentration. Mackie hovered near the evidence board, adding notes and sketches. These symbols aren't just random. They're specific to summoning rituals found in the Ars Goetia, part of the Lesser Key of Solomon. It's serious, Trapp. Whoever did this was trying to call up something they shouldn't. Trapp nodded, her mind racing. The historical context Mackie provided was invaluable, yet it deepened her concern. Last time we saw something like this, it didn't end well, she reminded him, her voice tense. Yeah, but last time we didn't catch it this early, Mackie countered, trying to inject some optimism into the grim atmosphere. Deciding they needed more historical data, Trapp suggested a visit to the New York Public Library. The library's extensive archives on occult history might provide insights into whether similar events had occurred in the city's past. At the library, the vast rows of ancient texts and modern tomes on mysticism presented a daunting task. With help from a particularly knowledgeable librarian, they zeroed in on a collection of books about New York's occult history. Hours of research uncovered unsettling parallels. A series of summoning rituals had indeed been performed over the decades, each corresponding with historical disturbances throughout the city. Look at this, Trapp said, pointing to an old newspaper clipping. In 1924, a similar event happened right here in Manhattan, caused a blackout that lasted for hours. And here, she flipped to another record. In 1978, the same symbols were found at a site where 3 people vanished without a trace. Mackie leaned over her shoulder, his eyes scanning the text. It's a cycle, he concluded, and it's accelerating. Their research was interrupted by an urgent call from the precinct. Another disturbance had been reported, this time in Central Park. Without hesitation, Trapp and Mackie gathered their notes and hurried to the scene. Arriving at Central Park, they found a scene eerily similar to the morning's chaos. Another circle, another failed summoning, and more questions than answers. As they secured the area, Trapp felt the weight of history bearing down on them. Whatever was happening, it was linked not just to the city's present, but to its past as well. As night began to fall, the pieces started to form a terrifying picture. Someone wasn't just dabbling in the occult. They were attempting to rewrite the city's fate with it. Determined to prevent another episode, Trapp and Mackie prepared for a long night ahead, knowing that this was only the beginning of what could be an unprecedented threat. Chapter 3: Sigils and Shadows. The chill of the evening air seemed to intensify as Detective Trapp and Mackie left Central Park. Their next destination was one they had hoped to avoid: the New York Museum of Occult History. If they were to understand the scale of the threat, they needed expertise that stretched beyond conventional archives. Upon arriving, they were greeted by Dr. Helena Voss, a leading historian in occult practices with whom they had collaborated on previous cases. Dr. Voss's office was a cavernous room lined with artifacts and ancient manuscripts, each piece whispering secrets of the past. Trap, Mackie. Dr. Voss acknowledged them with a nod as she set aside an aged tome she had been studying. I heard about your case. I presume you're here for insights into these summoning incidents. Yes, Trap confirmed, unfolding a city map dotted with the locations of the rituals. We've found a pattern, but we need to understand what or who we're dealing with. Dr. Voss peered at the map, her fingers tracing the marked sites. These aren't random. There's a geometry to these locations, a deliberate design. It's a summoning grid, she explained, her tone serious. And it's ancient, very ancient. Mackie unfolded several sketches of the sigils they had found. Do these mean anything to you? Dr. Voss examined the symbols closely, her brow furrowed. After a long pause, she spoke. These are not just any sigils. They're markers, each representing a different elemental power. Whoever is orchestrating this is trying to harness these elements to invoke something powerful. The gravity of her words hung heavily in the air. Trap felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Do you know how we can stop it? It's complex, Dr. Voss sighed, turning to retrieve a heavy, leather-bound book from her shelf. This tome contains rituals that can counteract the grid, but it requires precise execution and a lot of courage. As they discussed the specifics, an alarm from Trap's phone interrupted them. She glanced at the screen. Another incident, this time in the financial district. We have to go, she said, urgency lacing her voice. Take this, Dr. Voss handed Mackie the ancient book. You might need it more than I do tonight. Racing to the financial district, the night seemed to close in around them. They arrived to find chaos. A pillar of fire soared into the sky from a park amidst the skyscrapers, drawing a crowd of onlookers and emergency responders struggling to contain the situation. Trap and Mackie pushed through the crowd, reaching the epicenter just as the flames began to form shapes, serpentine and shifting. Mackie opened the tome to a marked page, shouting over the roar of the fire. Trap, we need to disrupt the sigil's core. It's feeding the fire. Without hesitation, Trap moved closer to the blaze, her coat shielding her from the intense heat. Using a spray can of salt water Dr. Voss had provided, she began to draw counter sigils around the fiery pillar. The air crackled with energy as each symbol hit the ground, the fire pulsing as if in protest. With one final sigil, the fire shuddered, then collapsed inward, vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind scorched earth and a stunned silence. Breathing heavily, Trap and Mackie looked at each other, relief mixed with resolve in their eyes. This is just the beginning, isn't it? Mackie asked, though it was more a statement than a question. Trap nodded, her gaze fixed on the smoldering ground. Yeah, and we're going to be ready for it. Chapter 4: Whispers in the Dark. The city that never sleeps had found a new reason to stay awake. Word of the spectacular extinguishing of the pillar of fire in the financial district spread through New York like wildfire, sparking rumors and fear alike. For Detective Trap and Mackie, the spectacle was a stark reminder that their battle against the unseen forces was far from over. As dawn broke, they found themselves back at the precinct, poring over Dr. Voss's tome and other evidence they had collected. Despite their exhaustion, the urgency of the situation fueled their resolve. They were piecing together a mystical puzzle, one dangerous revelation at a time. Trap's phone rang, cutting through the low hum of the early morning office. It was an officer reporting a disturbance at an abandoned subway station on the Lower East Side. The description was vague, but unsettling. Disembodied whispers echoing through the tunnels, causing unease among the transit workers. With no time to waste, Trap and Mackie headed to the site. The old subway entrance was cloaked in shadows, the morning light failing to penetrate its depths. As they descended, the air grew colder, and a faint murmur grew clearer. It was like listening to a distant conversation, words tangled in a chilling breeze. Inside the station, the walls were damp with condensation, and graffiti sprawled across them. But among the usual tags, Trap noticed something different. Sigils similar to those they had seen before, faintly glowing with an eerie light. Mackie, notebook in hand, sketched the new symbols. These aren't just for summoning, they're communicative. This place isn't just a hub for trains, it's a hub for spirits, he muttered, his voice echoing slightly in the empty station. They followed the whispers down the tunnel, the sounds growing in intensity. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, replaced by a single, clear voice. "Leave this place," it said, a warning that resonated in the still air. Mackie stepped forward, speaking softly into the darkness. "We mean no harm. We seek to understand and to help if we can." The air shifted, and a figure appeared in the dim light, translucent and trembling. It was a young woman, her form flickering like an old film reel. She pointed towards the end of the platform, her mouth moving in silent words before she vanished completely. Trap and Mackie exchanged a look, a silent agreement passing between them. They moved towards where she had pointed, finding a hidden alcove. Within it, another set of symbols was etched into the wall, these ones encircling a small, old pocket watch. As Trap reached out to touch it, the station shuddered as if a train were passing through, though they knew none had run here for years. The watch began to tick loudly, the hands moving backward. When the shaking stopped, the watch fell silent. Mackie picked it up, examining it. "This watch isn't just a watch. It's a key," he said, turning to Trap. "A key to what happened here, and perhaps to what's happening now." They left the station with the watch, the whispers now silent, their mission growing broader with each encounter. They needed to unlock the past if they were to save the present. Chapter 5: The Binding. After leaving the eerie quiet of the abandoned subway station, Detective Trap and Mackie returned to their makeshift command center at the precinct, their new evidence in hand. The old pocket watch, still silent and unassuming, sat on the table between them, a relic that seemed increasingly central to the unfolding mysteries. Trap, feeling the weight of their discoveries, called Dr. Voss, hoping the historian's expertise could shed light on the watch's significance. Within the hour, Dr. Voss arrived, her curiosity piqued by their description of the events at the station. "This is no ordinary watch, Dr. Voss confirmed, examining it under a magnifier. See here, these engravings around the edge? They correspond to protective wards, but they've been altered, tampered with somehow. Mackie leaned in, his eyes tracing the delicate patterns. Could this have been used to bind a spirit to the station? Possibly, Dr. Voss replied. And if so, releasing that spirit could have unforeseen consequences. Their discussion was abruptly interrupted by an urgent call from another precinct. A series of sudden, unexplained collapses had occurred at a construction site in Midtown, where workers reported seeing apparitions and experiencing severe disorientation. With Dr. Voss's warnings in mind, Trap and Mackie rushed to the site. They arrived to find emergency services tending to the injured, while confused and frightened workers recounted their experiences. The ground just gave way, one worker explained to Trap, his voice shaking. But it wasn't like any sinkhole I've ever seen. It was like the earth was alive, moving. Mackie, examining the perimeter, noticed faint sigils on some of the construction equipment, similar to those they had seen at the subway station. Trap, over here, he called out. This isn't just an accident. It's another binding site. Realizing the urgency, they set to work. Mackie sketched the sigils in his notebook, comparing them to those in Dr. Voss's books. Meanwhile, Trap coordinated with the site foreman to halt all work until they could ensure the area's safety. Their investigation led them to a partially demolished wall where more symbols were hidden beneath layers of paint and plaster. As they uncovered each symbol, the air grew tenser, a palpable charge building around them. Whatever's bound here doesn't want to be found, Mackie murmured, just as a low rumble echoed through the ground. The workers stepped back, fear rising anew. Trap, ever the pragmatist, steadied her nerves. We need to break the binding, Mackie, carefully. Together, they began a counter-ritual, using the knowledge Dr. Voss had shared. Mackie recited incantations, while Trap drew new, cleansing sigils around the old. The atmosphere shifted, the pressure easing as the ground settled. After several tense minutes, the rumbling ceased. The air cleared, and the workers looked on in awe, the threat seemingly abated. As they packed up their equipment, Mackie looked to Trap. Every one of these incidents is connected, not just by magic, but by fear. Whoever's behind this is feeding on it. Trap nodded, her resolve hardening. Then we find them, Mackie. We find them, and we stop them. Chapter 6. Glimpses. The chill of an early October morning did little to dampen the city's underlying tension as Detective Trap and Mackie continued their investigations. The incidents were growing not only in frequency, but in intensity, a pattern that both intrigued and alarmed them. Following the unsettling events at the construction site, Trap had barely slept, her mind preoccupied with the implications of their discoveries. The incidents weren't isolated. They were symptoms of a deeper, more malignant force at work within the city. That morning, they received a call from an old acquaintance, Madame Ilara, a clairvoyant who had occasionally provided insights into their more unusual cases. "Detective Trap, you and your partner should come to see me," she urged over the phone. There are things you need to know. Visions I've had regarding the disturbances. Intrigued and desperate for any leads, they made their way to Madame Alara's parlor, a quaint, dimly lit room filled with the heavy scent of incense and walls lined with mystical tomes and artifacts. The medium greeted them with a solemn nod, her eyes clouded with concern. As I've touched the edges of the ethereal plane these past nights, Madame Alara began, her voice a low whisper. I've seen glimpses of a shadow that grows darker, feeding on the chaos you are trying to contain. Trap exchanged a wary look with Mackie. Can you show us these visions somehow? Or guide us on how to see them? She asked, skepticism tinged with hope. Madame Alara motioned for them to sit before a small, circular table where a crystal ball lay under a dark cloth. I will try, but be warned. The visions are not always clear, and often they are more disturbing than enlightening. With the room darkened, Madame Alara lifted the cloth, her hands hovering over the crystal ball. The air thickened, and a soft, eerie light began to emanate from the orb. Trap and Mackie leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the swirling mist within. Gradually, images began to form, shadowy figures around the ritual sites, a network of dark energies connecting the sigils, and a cloaked figure whose face remained frustratingly obscured. Each vision was accompanied by a sense of deep malice and foreboding. These are not just random acts, Madame Alara said, breaking the tense silence as the light faded. There is a mastermind, a puppeteer pulling the strings, using ancient rituals to open gateways for something much darker. Trap felt a chill run down her spine. The implications were terrifying. Do you see where we can find this person? Any clues on their identity? The medium shook her head sadly. The visions are shadowed by the same dark energy that fuels them. But she paused, her gaze intense. Focus on the connections, the lines that bind these events. They will lead you to him. As they left the parlor, Trap felt a mix of frustration and motivation. The day's work was cut out for them. They needed to map out the ritual sites in detail, tracing the connections Madame Alara had seen in her visions. Back at the precinct, they spread out a city map, marking each incident site with red pins. Lines drawn between them began to form a sinister pattern, a web that sprawled across the cityscape. Each line seemed to converge towards a central point, a location they hadn't yet investigated. This is our next stop, Trap declared, her finger pressing firmly on the map. Whatever's waiting for us there, it's time we faced it head on. Chapter 7. Crossroads. Armed with the coordinates derived from Madame Alara's visions and the ominous pattern they traced on the map, Detective Trap and Mackie set out under a slate gray sky that seemed to echo the gravity of their quest. The location pinpointed was an old, abandoned warehouse district on the edge of the city, long forgotten by most, but apparently central to their mysterious antagonists' plans. As they drove, the streets became less familiar and more desolate, the echoes of the city's life fading behind them. The warehouse loomed ahead, a relic of rusted metal and broken windows, its vast doors hanging ominously ajar. "This is it," Mackie murmured, his usual buoyancy subdued by the chill of the place. They equipped themselves with flashlights and the necessary tools to break magical seals, should they find any. Stepping inside, their lights pierced the darkness, revealing sprawling graffiti that was less the work of vandals and more the sigils of binding and summoning they had come to know all too well. The air was thick, charged with a palpable energy that made both of them uneasy. "This place is a nexus," Mackie noted, his voice echoing off the high, empty walls. "A crossroads of magical energies. It's not just a location, it's a gateway." They proceeded with caution, each step taking them deeper into the labyrinth of the warehouse. The sigils became more frequent and intricate as they approached the center of the building, where an elaborate ritual circle had been etched into the concrete floor. Trap felt a shiver run through her as they stood at the edge of the circle. The air seemed to twist and pulse around them, shadows flickering at the corners of their vision. "We need to disrupt this, but carefully," she instructed, her eyes scanning the complex symbols for the right point of intervention. Mackie nodded, withdrawing a small spray bottle filled with a saltwater mixture Dr. Voss had prepared for them. He began to carefully apply it to specific points around the circle, each hiss of the spray punctuating the heavy silence. Suddenly, a low growl rumbled through the ground, and the shadows coalesced into a more definite shape. A dark figure standing at the opposite side of the circle. Trap and Mackie froze, watching as the figure stepped forward, its features obscured by a hood. "I wondered when you would come," the figure spoke, its voice a chilling blend of echoes. "You have been persistent." "Who are you? What are you trying to do here?" Trap demanded, her hand instinctively reaching for her weapon. The figure chuckled, a sound that seemed to crawl along the walls. "I am a harbinger of the new order, and you," he gestured broadly at the sigils, "are witnesses to the dawn of a new era, one where the boundaries between worlds will dissolve." "We won't let you bring whatever it is you're trying to summon into this world," Mackie interjected firmly, taking a step closer. The figure's laughter grew louder. "You think you have a choice," he taunted, then raised his hands, the air around him crackling with energy. In that instant, Trap knew they had to act. "Now, Mackie!" she shouted. They both moved, disrupting the last of the sigils as the figure's spell unleashed. A blast of force knocked them backward, but the ritual circle broke, the energy dissipating as quickly as it had risen. The figure screamed, a sound of rage and pain, then vanished into the ether, leaving behind a ringing silence. Trap and Mackie lay on the ground, catching their breath. The immediate threat was over, but the victory was hollow. They knew this was but a battle in what might be a long war. "We stopped him, for now," Mackie said, helping Trap to her feet. "Yeah," she replied, looking around at the now inert sigils. "But this is far from over. We need to be ready for what comes next." Chapter 8. The Hunted. The aftermath of the warehouse confrontation left Detective Trap and Mackie with more questions than answers. The mysterious figure had vanished, but the threat he posed lingered in the air, a shadow over the city that refused to dissipate. As they reported back to Dr. Voss at her office, laden with notes and remnants of disrupted sigils, her concern was palpable. You've done well to stop him this time, but he will try again, she cautioned, her gaze intense as she examined the artifacts they had collected. This man, this harbinger, he's not just a rogue practitioner. He's deeply connected to the ancient magical networks that underpin the city's foundations. Trap felt a chill. How do we find him again? He seems to be able to vanish at will. That's where I might be able to help, Dr. Voss replied, pulling out an old leather-bound map from her collection. This is a map of the city's ley lines, the magical currents that flow beneath the streets. He's using these lines to enhance his power and move unseen. Mackie leaned over the map, tracing the lines that intersected with the locations of the previous disturbances. If we can predict his next move based on these lines, we can set a trap. Trap finished his thought, her mind racing with possibilities. Their planning was interrupted by an urgent call from the precinct. Trap answered it to hear a breathless dispatcher. Detective, you and Officer McAfee need to come immediately. There's been an incident at the Museum of Natural History, a magical disturbance. They arrived at the museum to find a scene of chaos. Artifacts had been animated by some unseen force, wreaking havoc. As they made their way to the main hall, they realized that this disturbance was a diversion, a way to draw them away from investigating the ley lines. Amidst the chaos, Trap caught sight of a familiar shadow slipping through the back door. Without a word, she and Mackie gave chase, following the figure as it darted through the streets, moving towards one of the ley line intersections Dr. Voss had shown them. The pursuit led them into the heart of an old city park, where the veil between worlds felt thinner, the air tinged with the echo of ancient magics. The figure stopped at the center of the park, turning to face them as they approached. You cannot stop what is already in motion, he hissed, his voice a blend of defiance and desperation. The gates will open, regardless of your efforts. We can stop you, though, Trap countered, stepping closer. Why are you doing this? What are you hoping to achieve? His laughter was hollow. I am not the architect of this plan. I am merely a servant to greater powers, the powers that seek to balance the scales. Before they could react, the ground beneath them shivered, and spectral hands reached up, pulling at their feet, trying to drag them into the earth. Mackie reacted swiftly, pulling out a consecrated charm Dr. Voss had given them, and forming a protective circle around them with salt. As the hands receded, the figure took advantage of their distraction to escape once again, leaving them in the quiet of the empty park. The threat temporarily abated, but far from over. We need to prepare, Mackie said, his voice somber. He's right about one thing. The gates will continue to be a target. Trap nodded, her resolve hardening. Then, let's make sure we're ready for whatever comes through them. Chapter 9. Reflections. In the wake of the encounter at the park, Detective Trap and Mackie returned to the precinct, their minds racing with the implications of the Harbinger's warning. The realization that they were dealing not with a lone rogue, but a pawn in a much larger scheme weighed heavily on them. Back at the office, they spread the map of the city's ley lines across the table, their previous chase highlighting several potential hotspots that could be the next targets. Trap's phone rang, disrupting their planning. It was the mayor's office, urgently requesting their presence. At City Hall, they were ushered into a tense meeting. The mayor, flanked by advisors, wasted no time. The disturbances you've been tracking have caused enough panic. What's being done to stop this from escalating further? Trap explained their findings, emphasizing the complexity of the situation. It's not just criminal activity, Mr. Mayor. These are ancient magical forces at work, tied to the city's very foundation. We're doing everything we can to predict and prevent further incidents. The mayor nodded, his expression grave. Keep me updated, Detective. The city can't afford a full-blown crisis. Returning to the precinct, Trap and Mackie realized they needed more than just maps and charms. They needed to understand the magical forces themselves. Deciding to consult with another expert, they visited Professor Liam Caldwell, a renowned anthropologist known for his studies on urban mythology and magical phenomena. Professor Caldwell greeted them in his cluttered university office, books and artifacts piled high. Detective Trap, Officer McAfee, what brings you to my humble abode? After explaining their situation, Caldwell nodded, pulling out an ancient-looking book. You're dealing with the convergence, he said, flipping through the dusty pages. It's a rare celestial alignment that amplifies magical energies. It's no coincidence that your harbinger chose this time to act. He pointed to an illustration showing the city overlaid with a network of converging lines. These ley lines you're monitoring, they'll become conduits for tremendous energy when the convergence reaches its peak. Whatever is coming through, it'll be drawn to these points. Armed with new knowledge, Trap and Mackie spent the next days fortifying the identified hotspots, setting up surveillance and protective sigils. Despite their preparations, the unease persisted. Late one evening, while reviewing security footage from one of the hotspots, Trap noticed a peculiar anomaly, a reflection in a window that showed a distorted figure that wasn't there when the video was paused. Intrigued and disturbed, they decided to investigate the location themselves. Arriving at the scene, they found nothing out of the ordinary, until Mackie's flashlight beam caught a glimpse of something unusual. Following the light, they discovered a mirror, old and unassuming, leaning against an alley wall. As they approached, the air grew thick, and the mirror's surface rippled like water. Trap reached out, her hand hesitating before touching the glass. To her shock, her reflection's movements didn't mirror hers. They beckoned. With a deep breath, Trap pushed her hand through the mirror's surface, which gave way like a liquid portal. Her hand disappeared into the glass, and visions assaulted her senses. Flashes of other places, other times, all converging on the city. Pulling back, Trap and Mackie exchanged a look of bewildered horror. The mirror isn't just reflecting light, Mackie murmured. It's reflecting possibilities, paths we might take. They left the mirror intact, a sentinel of potentialities in the heart of the city, as they prepared to face whatever would come through next, knowing now that their reality was only one of many, and the reflections held the key. Chapter 10: The Gathering Storm. As the date of the convergence approached, the the city's undercurrent of magic became palpably tense, with the ley lines practically humming with energy. Detective Trap and Mackie's efforts to fortify the hotspots seemed to hold, but the air was thick with anticipation of what was to come. One morning, as Trap reviewed the citywide magical surveillance network they had set up with the help of Professor Caldwell and Dr. Voss, a series of alarms went off. Multiple ley line intersections were experiencing significant magical disturbances simultaneously. It wasn't just one event. It was a coordinated series of events stretching their resources thin. Trap coordinated with the NYPD to dispatch units to each site, while she and Mackie headed to the most active location, Times Square. The area was crowded with people, the air crackling with not just electricity, but a kind of ethereal energy that made the hair on their necks stand on end. As they arrived, they saw why. Above the square, a storm was forming, not of clouds and rain, but of raw, magical energy. Bolts of light shot across the sky, not striking down, but swirling around, forming a vortex of power. "Looks like we're right in the eye," Mackie shouted over the roar of the energy storm. He pulled out the tome from Dr. Voss, flipping to a section on energy dispersion. "We need to disrupt the vortex center. It's pulling energy from all the ley lines." Trap nodded, directing the police to evacuate the area as they worked. Using a combination of the tome's spells and their own quick thinking, they managed to set up a counter-ritual right in the heart of Times Square. As they activated the ritual, the vortex began to wobble, the bolts of light bending inward before dissipating into the air, leaving behind only the faintest trace of ozone. Breathing heavily, they watched as the city returned to normal, the magical storm subsiding as quickly as it had formed. "That was too close," Trap said, watching the crowd slowly return, oblivious to how close they had come to a catastrophe. Mackie nodded, but his eyes were on the tome. According to this, today's event was just a precursor. The real convergence hasn't even started. Knowing they needed more help, Trap decided to call in reinforcements from other cities, experts in magical defenses. Over the next few days, a small army of practitioners and scholars descended on NYC, each bringing their own knowledge and power to bolster the city's defenses. Together, they prepared for the worst, setting up a massive protective spell around the city's major ley line intersections. Trap coordinated with the city officials to keep the public safe and unaware, while Mackie and the team of magicians focused on strengthening the magical barriers. The night before the convergence, they all gathered in Central Park, the epicenter of the city's ley lines. Trap looked around at the group, a mix of hardened NYPD officers and robed magicians, all working together. It was an unusual sight, but it gave her hope. As midnight approached, they all took their positions, forming a circle around the Bethesda fountain, which Professor Caldwell had identified as the primary nexus point. Together, they began the chant Dr. Voss had prepared, their voices rising into the night. The energy in the air peaked, the ground trembling under their feet, and then, as quickly as it had risen, it calmed. The convergence was upon them, and they were ready to face whatever it brought through. Chapter 11. The Rift. As the clock struck midnight, the assembled group in Central Park felt the ground beneath them pulse with a surge of energy. The air shimmered, and for a moment, everything was silent, as if the city itself held its breath. Then, with a sound like cracking thunder, a rift appeared above the Bethesda fountain, tearing through the very fabric of reality. The rift was a swirling vortex of colors, a gateway between worlds that threatened to merge the mystical with the mundane. Energy spilled from it, warping the air and distorting the scenery. Detective Trap, standing firm despite the chaos, signaled for the ritual to continue. Mackie, his voice steady, led the incantation, drawing on the collective power of the magicians and the prepared spells to stabilize the rift. The practitioners around the circle chanted in unison, their words weaving a complex spell designed to contain and eventually close the gateway. As they worked, shadows began to emerge from the rift, forms that were neither entirely human nor creature, inhabitants of a realm that was not meant to intersect with theirs. Trap, alongside a team of specially trained officers, confronted these beings, employing non-lethal means designed by Dr. Voss to repel the intruders without causing harm. One of the shadows, larger and more defined than the others, advanced toward the circle. It was the Harbinger, his form now twisted by the energies he had sought to harness. "You cannot stop the inevitable," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the park. Trap stepped forward, her resolve as strong as the spell she protected. "This is our world, our home. You are not welcome here," she shouted back, holding a talisman Dr. Voss had provided, which glowed with a light strong enough to repel the dark energies. The battle raged beneath the rift, each side pushing against the other. Mackie, noticing a fluctuation in the energy flow, saw an opportunity. "Now, focus all energy on the talisman," he directed. The group redirected their efforts, channeling all their magical strength through Trap and her talisman. With a blinding flash of light that illuminated the entire park, the talisman exploded in a wave of pure energy, forcing the Harbinger and his shadows back through the rift. The gateway began to close, the edges crumbling away as the reality of the park solidified once again. Exhausted but triumphant, the group watched as the last of the rift sealed shut. The night returned to calm, the stars visible above as if nothing had occurred. They had prevented a catastrophe, preserving the boundary between their world and the unknown. In the aftermath, as the magicians and officers disbanded, Trap and Mackie lingered. "What now?" Mackie asked, looking at the spot where the rift had been. "We stay vigilant," Trap replied, her eyes scanning the horizon. "This might be over, but there's always a next time, and we'll be ready." They walked out of the park together, the city around them peaceful for now, but both knew that the peace was hard-earned and fragile. The world was full of mysteries and dangers, but also of protectors who stood ready to defend it. Chapter 12, Penultimate. The city was quiet in the aftermath of the rift's closure, but the silence was deceptive. Detective Trap and Mackie knew all too well that the battle they had won was just one part of a larger war. The events at Central Park had shown them the potential devastation that could result from the magical disturbances. They also knew that the Harbinger, though repelled for now, was still a threat. In the days following the event, The city began to recover, but a palpable tension lingered in the air. People went about their daily lives, yet there was a newfound wariness, a glance over the shoulder that hadn't been there before. The magical community, both the practitioners who had helped defend the city and those who had remained on the sidelines, was more active than ever. Their efforts coordinated by Dr. Voss and Professor Caldwell, who had established a temporary council to oversee the city's mystical defenses. Trap and Mackie spent long hours with the council, planning and preparing. They knew that the Harbinger had not been acting alone. The energy and resources required to open the rift suggested a larger network or force at play. Determined to uncover the full extent of the threat, they delved deeper into the investigation, using both conventional detective work and the insights of their magical allies. Their break came when an anonymous tip led them to an old industrial complex on the outskirts of the city. The complex had been abandoned for years, or so it seemed. Surveillance footage, painstakingly reviewed by Trap, revealed brief, fleeting glimpses of activity, figures moving in and out of the shadows, too indistinct to identify, but clearly up to no good. With the team assembled, Trap and Mackie led a raid on the complex. The place was a labyrinth of old machinery and storage containers, a perfect hideout for those wishing to stay hidden. As they moved through the dark, echoing spaces, the sense of imminent danger grew. They found the Harbinger in the heart of the complex, surrounded by artifacts and symbols that thrummed with dark energy. He was not alone. Several figures stood with him, masked and robed, their intentions clear as they prepared another ritual, this one even larger than the last. "We can't let you do this," Trap called out, her team fanning out behind her, weapons and magical wards at the ready. The Harbinger turned, his face a mask of fury and disdain. "You are too late, Detective. The gates will open, and our new world will begin." A fierce battle ensued, magical energies clashing with the tactical efforts of Trap's team. Mackie, using his knowledge of occult symbols, disrupted the ritual's focal points, while Trap engaged the Harbinger directly. The fight was intense and chaotic, each side pushing the other to the brink. As the conflict reached its climax, Trap found herself face to face with the Harbinger. With a desperate, decisive move, she used the talisman, supercharged now with the collective energy of her allies, to strike at him. The impact was like a shockwave, the Harbinger's defenses crumbling under the force. With the ritual disrupted and their leader defeated, the remaining figures fled, disappearing into the shadows from which they had emerged. The Harbinger was taken into custody, his plans thwarted, but his resolve unbroken. "We've won this battle," Mackie said as they surveyed the scene, the air still crackling with residual energy. "But the war goes on," Trap replied, her gaze steady and resolute. "As long as there are those who seek to misuse these powers, we'll be here to stop them." Chapter 13. The New Dawn. The morning after the intense confrontation at the industrial complex was unusually calm. The early light filtered softly through the cityscape, touching the streets with a gentleness that belied the tumult of the night before. Detective Trap stood at her apartment window, coffee in hand, watching the city awaken. Despite the peace, her mind churned with the events that had unfolded and the responsibilities that lay ahead. The Harbinger was in custody, a significant victory, but the network he was part of still lurked in the shadows. The battle might have ended, but the war against the misuse of magical forces was far from over. She knew that new challenges would arise, but for the first time in a long while, she felt genuinely prepared to meet them. At the precinct, Trap and Mackie, along with Dr. Voss, Professor Caldwell, and representatives from the Magical Council, gathered for a debriefing. The room buzzed with a quiet intensity as they discussed the implications of their recent success and the strategies for the future. "We've been reactive for too long," Trap addressed the room. "It's time we take proactive steps to ensure the safety of the city. We need a permanent task force dedicated to these cases, one that integrates our conventional methods with the insights of the magical community." Nods of agreement met her suggestion, and plans began to form. A new unit would be created, one that bridged the gap between the NYPD and the magical practitioners of New York. Mackie was proposed as the liaison, a role he accepted with a solemn nod, understanding the importance of his position. As the meeting concluded, Trap felt a sense of accomplishment, but also a heavy weight of expectation. She and Mackie decided to take a walk through Central Park, the site of their recent battle, now peaceful and bustling with the everyday joys of city life. As they walked, they discussed their future and the future of the city they were sworn to protect. "Things will be different now," Mackie said, looking around at the laughing children and jogging couples. "Harder in some ways, but better. We're better prepared, and we're not alone." Trap smiled, her thoughts mirroring his. "We've seen what happens when these forces are left unchecked. That won't happen again. Not on our watch." Their path took them past the Bethesda fountain, where the rift had opened. It was tranquil now, just another beautiful landmark. Yet both knew the significance of this place, the battles fought and won. It was a reminder of their victories and the challenges yet to come. As the sun set, casting long shadows and bathing the park in a golden light, Trap and Mackie paused at the fountain. They looked at each other, allies and friends, their bond strengthened by the trials they had endured together. "This is our new dawn, Mackie," Trap said, her voice resolute yet hopeful. "A new era for all of us." Mackie nodded, his eyes reflecting the same resolve. "To the new dawn," he echoed. Together, they turned back toward the city, ready to face whatever came next, secure in the knowledge that they were not just guardians of the present, but stewards of the future.